This week's episode of our show has been sponsored by our wonderful friends at World Anvil.
If you haven't heard of World Anvil, they're a web-based world-building platform and campaign manager with all types of creators in mind.
For Dungeon Masters, this is one of the best digital tool sets out there. It's a powerful platform that lets you organize all of your campaign notes from lore, geography, timelines, non-player characters, and more, with even great templates to help you if you need some extra guidance.
One of my favorite parts about World Anvil is that they have interactive maps that you can create and share with your players, with information for the players and secret information that's just for you as a DM.
World Anvil is great to use at the table to organize your thoughts and creations and have them accessible at the click of a button, or even share them with the wider RPG game community.
The best part is that an account at World Anvil is free and offers all the basic features, allowing you to get a good taste of what the platform offers.
There's some fantastic advanced features available at the Master and Grandmaster level, so if you're interested in checking those out, you can use the discount code DungeonDudes to save up to 20% off the first part of your membership.
You can find all of this by following the links below or at worldanvil.com. And now, on to this week's episode.
I love Dungeons & Dragons because it lets me explore my creativity and create my own worlds, settings, peoples, and places. And while the rules of Dungeons & Dragons offer so many fantastic options and inspiration for doing this, sometimes those rules fall short. There's not a perfect option for that magical sword, the mystical abilities of the characters that you have in mind, or that fantastic player character race or monster that is existing in your imagination. And it's time to create them for yourself.
Homebrewing can be one of the most rewarding parts of Dungeons & Dragons when done right, but it can also be one of the most difficult. Today we're going to talk about 5 simple rules to follow to get you started homebrewing.
Greetings, my name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Welcome to our channel where we discuss everything Dungeons & Dragons, including advice for players and guides for Dungeon Masters.
We upload new videos every Thursday, so please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
In this episode, we're going to be talking about 5 tips for starting out with homebrewing in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. These are some general principles, not hard rules, that you can use to guide yourself when you're creating new options to use in your Dungeons & Dragons game.
There's no right or wrong way to create homebrew content for Dungeons & Dragons, but there are a lot of simple pitfalls that are easy to avoid if you know what you're looking for. In this complicated and nuanced game, you may want to watch out for these when you're setting forth on your first time homebrewing.
Kelly and I have created lots of our own homebrew content for our campaigns over the years, and we found a lot of things that have worked really, really well for us in homebrewing, and some things that have been big mistakes that hopefully will never see the light of day.
Yeah.
And today we're just going to share some of these tips with you so that you can get started making your own truly unique homebrew content for your game. Let's get rolling.
Whether you're a dungeon master or player who's just getting started out with homebrewing, the number one rule that you want to look for is to start small and simple.
Homebrewing is difficult and it can be very time-consuming to get it right. And by starting small with some of the easier things to homebrew in Dungeons & Dragons, you can give yourself a little bit more experience so that you can move on to the much more complex parts of the rules. While we can always adapt the rules in play, homebrewing can be one of those things that impacts our campaign in a negative way. And especially if we jump into the deep end without a full comprehension of how our homebrew rules are going to work, we can kind of make a mess of our own campaigns. So by starting small and starting simple and learning the rules and using them as a tool, we can get much better homebrew that really integrates nicely into our games.
In the many years of Monty and I playing Dungeons & Dragons, we have homebrewed a lot of different types of content. What we have here now is a list of what we think the easiest things to homebrew are versus what we think the more difficult things to homebrew are. So let's go over what that list looks like.
We've ranked this list based on how complex these items are in play, how big of an impact they have on the game itself, but also how time-consuming they are to homebrew enough to the point that you've got things ready for a real campaign.
The first thing on our list that we rank as the easiest thing to homebrew is a new player character race. The reason for this is that there's a lot to already look at in the player's handbook and other sources of the races that already exist. you can use those as a simple template to create your own race using the same formula.
One of the other great things about homebrewing races is that there's something that player characters can access right away at first level, so it's really easy to measure their impact against the other options and what they do to the game. Next up, though, are magic items. And magic items are something that I think many dungeon masters just naturally start homebrewing right away. And fortunately, they're very compartmentalized. And because magic items are so compartmentalized, it makes them very easy to homebrew. There's plenty of examples in the rules. And if things end up a little bit unexpected, it's pretty easy to go back on things and change it.
We've actually done a whole video on how to homebrew magic items. And also, Monty and myself have created a whole list of 21 magic items that we've homebrewed, and you can find links to that down below.
Following along with magic items, many dungeon masters will naturally homebrew their own monsters and NPCs in the course of creating a campaign. Homebrewing monsters is actually pretty challenging and can be really time consuming. I probably spent more hours making creature stat blocks than anything else.
I can agree with that. I always want to add a little twist to my monsters or make something that suits the campaign setting that I'm creating. As we move into the more difficult side of this list, we look at spells and feats as the next option. The reason for this is that spells and feats are very important to be balanced to the level of play that's going on at the table.
Spells get increasingly harder to balance and homebrew based on their spell level as they get more and more complex. But even homebrewing a low-level spell or something like a cantrip can be really, really difficult to find the right place for that spell in all the other spells that exist.
Near the end of this list are subclasses and classes, which can be really difficult to homebrew just because of how nuanced and different each class and subclass can be, and the amount of rules involved in that.
A subclass or class is something that stretches across 20 levels of play, which means that it's virtually impossible to see the impact that your homebrew decisions will have in a single game session. If you create a new spell, or a new feat, or a new monster, or a magic item, or even a new player character race, you can play one game session and get a pretty good idea of how that thing is going to play out. But with a class, you cannot do that, because you need to have multiple encounters to really get the barometer for how it's performing and whether or not it's doing what you've created. So in that measure, the ramp up from the other things to creating a class or a subclass is so much higher.
The apex of this list may be homebrewing your own world, but that doesn't really interact with the other rules of Dungeons & Dragons as much. We also have a whole list of videos on homebrewing a world, which you can check out as well.
Yeah, and homebrewing your own adventures is another step up from this, but ultimately those are things that are going to see immediate play and don't have the mechanical baggage that the other elements do. There's lots of homebrewing that you can do in building your own worlds and adventures, but it's a very different set of skills than building a mechanical game feature that players are going to use.
And lastly, we have homebrewing house rules, which is kind of a wild card and really depending on the complexity of your house rule, can fit anywhere in this list.
Yeah, if you're homebrewing your own system for crafting magic items, that could be really, really complex and really time-consuming to build. But if you're just doing a very simple house rule for how your player characters are going to maybe manage a stronghold, or adapting some of the optional rules in the Dungeon Master's Guide, you might be able to rest on those with a lot of confidence. Again, with house rules, it's always great to use all the resources online, check in with other communities, and even post here on our comments and maybe get some feedback from us.
So with all that in mind, now that we've chosen our difficulty for how we're going to homebrew, it's time to think of our concept.
Creating a clear concept for what you want to homebrew is an often overlooked but essential step in the process. When you are going to create a homebrew game element, whether it's a race or a class or a spell, write 2 or 3 short sentences that describe it in natural language and really answer the question, what is the fantasy that you are trying to create with this homebrew option? What makes it magical? What makes it fun? What is your goal with creating this homebrew item?
You don't need to dive right into the nitty-gritty mechanics of your homebrew at first. It's really good to just sit down and consider to yourself, what's important to you about creating this? Why are you making it in the first place? And what's its purpose going to be at the table?
This conceptual statement will be your barometer for when you're actually building the mechanics around it. You can come back to this concept statement and say, did what I make fulfill what I set out to do? And furthermore, when you are sharing your homebrew with other people, whether it's your other player characters or folks that you want to get feedback from on the internet, you can use your concept statement to say, this is what I'm trying to do. Do the mechanics do this or not?
Once you've come up with your clear concept, you need to ask yourself probably one of the most important questions when you're getting into homebrewing, and that is, can I reskin something that already exists?
Never underestimate the power of reflavoring. There are so many game options that already exist, and that it may be possible to simply file off the serial numbers and change some of the flavor behind an existing mechanic in the game and get the results that you want.
Let's say you're setting out to create a steampunk world and you want different playable races for your steampunk world. There's no reason why you can't just take the dwarf, call it a mechanic, write different lore for it, but leave the attributes and things generally the same, and you'd gain the same thing. You give that to the players, and it's a completely new homebrewed concept. Or even with spells, look at other spells of the same level, think about how they work and what they do, reskin it, call it something different, add a different damage type, and you have a homebrew spell.
Yeah, Fireball could simply be a constructed steampunk grenade that your homebrew alchemist, really just a conjuration wizard, is throwing out. One of the benefits of reskinning and having this clear concept is that when you create your own homebrew, the learning curve of what you make could add a lot of complexity for the players and for yourself as well. So reskinning is a convenient way to skip over all that extra complexity, because you can just say, yeah, alchemists are just wizards with these different subclasses. That just maps on fine. There we go.
Following on this idea of reskinning and looking at things that already exist and manipulating them, that brings us to our third rule, which is to look at established material to inspire what you're going to be homebrewing.
We can also look at the established materials as a template for how to build our own homebrew content, because generally there's a few main bullet points that every game element, whether it's a new player character race or a magic item or a spell or a subclass or a class, needs to have. So if you deconstruct those and make the list and say, oh, my homebrew element needs to have this, 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 and this, well, now you've just made a list that you just need to fill out with comparable elements, and you've got your own homebrew right there.
So let's take a look at our different homebrew items and options and talk about how you can adapt a template to make this easier, starting with races.
Player character races are one of the first ports of call that really are the poster child for this concept, because most player character races have a few things in common. They all generally grant a +2 bonus to one ability score and a +1 bonus to another ability score based on the sub-race the player chooses. They often grant an additional proficiency, language, or tool proficiency, and most races then also have some sort of feature or packet of features that are roughly equivalent to a feat.
Instead of a feat, the race that you're homebrewing might get inherit spells, which might be a cantrip or possibly a first level spell that they can use once per day without using a spell slot or other components.
There's other races like tieflings that gain additional spells as they grow more powerful, and you can use the examples of tieflings and dark elves to base your abilities on. Generally speaking, the features that are granted to a player character race are never more powerful than anything that a character could gain at first level. So you really have to be careful when you're building, for example, a race that can fly, like the Aarakocra, and you can see that that is a race that gets very little in terms of other features because flying is such a huge advantage.
Keep in mind that when you are creating a template and using the existing races as one, you don't want to look to the human as the option. Humans give up a lot of these options for versatility, so they are not the ideal template for creating a race.
Yeah, I think looking at things like elves and dwarves are really good examples because I think they're some of the more well-balanced races, and so measuring your created one against those options rather than the weaker ones like Dragonborn or the stronger ones like variant humans and half-elves is a good middle ground.
Next up, if we look at monsters, there's a lot of great resources out there to help you create homebrew monsters. There's great generators online, like on D&D Beyond.
Well, the monster builders on D&D Beyond and other websites can help you construct the stat block and make sure that you're not missing any key details like the speed or the ability scores or skill proficiencies of your monster. One of the most difficult things to homebrew with a monster is determining its challenge rating. And this is where you really do need to go back to the Dungeon Master's Guide for help, because page 274 of the Dungeon Master's Guide has a table and a formula to help you assess the challenge rating of your monster, but it's not perfect. Figuring out challenge rating is much more art than science.
Challenge ratings can be such a fickle thing. Even changing a few spells out on a certain creature might drastically change their challenge rating. So it is a really difficult thing to conceptualize, and I try to look at as many monsters of that same challenge rating I'm going for and seeing if any of my abilities really outdo those monsters or are much weaker than those monsters.
Comparing to other monsters is a tried and true tactic, but it's not a perfect one. And oftentimes, the first time your monster is getting playtested is in your campaign itself. This is especially true if you're homebrewing stats for your big bad evil guy or a major NPC. And making a mistake could cost the lives of one of your player characters because you made the monster too powerful. Or the inverse, you got a really anticlimactic battle because your monster didn't have enough hit points. So often when I'm homebrewing monsters that are going to be facing my player characters directly, and that's the first time I'm going to get to try them out, I often do adjust on the fly and make sure that the monster has the hit points to survive the onslaught my player characters can throw at them.
With subclasses and classes, you also want to look at all of the other subclasses and classes that are in the books as your templates. See when they gain their abilities, what sort of abilities they get, and how powerful they are, and use that to gauge what you're going to do when you're homebrewing.
This is why homebrewing a class is so deceptively difficult, because the templates for what a class gains are readily apparent if you've looked at any of the class tables. It's really easy to just use the standard spellcasting progression for a full spellcaster. Just lift it right from the wizard or cleric. Or if you're doing a half caster, grab it from the ranger. Or maybe using the warlock's style of spellcasting. Once you've got that, everyone also knows when characters generally gain their ability score increases at 4th and 8th, 12th, 16th, and 19th level. So those are already filled out for you. And then generally everybody knows that classes usually choose their subclass at 3rd level, gain some sort of feature at level 6, something again at level 10 or 14. Most martial classes gain extra attack at level 5. So you get this laundry list of things that you can kind of build in automatically, but then it gets much harder from there.
When you're looking at the abilities that you're going to create as your character levels up, something that I like to do is look at spells that that character would be able to cast if they were a spellcaster and see how powerful those spells are and make sure that my abilities that I'm creating are not more powerful than a spell or other ability of that same level.
If you create a custom ability for a class and then compare it to a spell of that level and go, wow, this ability that I created is much more powerful than a 7th level spell, so maybe it's not right for 14th level, you could bump it up to later, or consider limiting how often that ability can be used. On the flip side, if you homebrew an ability that is weaker than a spell of a level available to characters of that level, you might allow that ability to be used more often. So don't underestimate how potent putting a limit on the number of times per day a player character can use a custom ability of a class or a spell or a magic item or even monster abilities as a way of clamping down on the power level. Because if something's really, really good, but you only get to do it once, that does make it a strategic choice.
Just look at Action Surge from the fighter. It's one of the best abilities, and it's really powerful, but they only get to use it once.
And then they have to take a short rest to gain it back.
When it comes to feats and spells, it's pretty simple. Just look at other feats and spells of the same level and same concept, and make sure that you're not overpowering your feats or spells to be drastically overpowered or underpowered compared.
One of the key decisions when you're homebrewing a feat is whether your feat is going to be one of those full feats that is just a bunch of new perks, or the half feat, which is a +1 bonus to an ability score with a minor perk. So that is kind of like the template that feats follow in D&D 5e. They're either one of those two types, and they usually gain either 3 different abilities or an ability score boost and 1 little perk.
And don't forget, if you're homebrewing spells, check out page 284 of the Dungeon Master's Guide, where there's a nice little table there to help you adjudicate the amount of damage that your spell should do at a certain level.
Otherwise, you need to compare your spell to other spells of the same level and find out if the effect is roughly comparable or not. Ask yourself the question, is my spell offering something that characters would not normally have at this level? For instance, if you create a spell that allows a player character to mind control another character, and that spell is higher than 5th level, that's making it a little bit better than Dominate Person. So, is it okay to have a mind control spell as a 1st level spell? It's up to you, but you've got to decide if the costs of that are worth it. One of the final points when we look through the rules of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition is that drawbacks and penalties are very rare. It's not common for a player character class to have a very powerful ability that is attached to some form of drawback or additional cost beyond how many times it can be used per day.
If you are going to create an ability that has a drawback, you might want to look at things like the Barbarian's Frenzy ability or the Evoker's Overchannel ability, which both have a slight drawback in comparison to the ability that they gain.
Yeah, they either cause exhaustion or deal damage back to the player character. But again, this is a very, very difficult thing to balance, and there are very few examples in the rules that give us a clear case of how to balance a new power with a drawback. So these are things you definitely want to test out in your game.
So with all this in mind, let's look at some of the things that you may want to watch out for when you're homebrewing. And there's actually some great useful tips in the Dungeon Master's Guide.
It's very easy to miss, but on page 263 of the Dungeon Master's Guide, the developers have told us that there are 3 things to really be careful with when we are thinking of adding them as a homebrew element to our games. These are elements that can cause unexpected rules interactions or mess with some of the core principles of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition.
The first one being mechanics that allow a player character to take more than one action or bonus action on their turn.
The second is any effect which allows a player character to concentrate on multiple spells at once.
And the third being giving a player character the option to attune to more than 3 magic items that require attunement.
Now, these are not ironclad rules. There's plenty of exceptions in the base rules of 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons itself. Action Surge allows fighters to take extra actions after all, and Haste allows for additional bonus actions.
Also, if you look at some of the potions that you can get in Dungeons & Dragons, potions of flight or potions of speed, these allow spellcasters to not have to concentrate on those spells while concentrating on other spells as well.
And indeed, there have been some explorations of changing what magic items require attunement or allowing characters to attune to multiple magic items under very specific circumstances, although that attunement rule has been very rarely broken overall. These kind of mechanics are amongst the most challenging ones to strike the right balance, and it can be very tempting to add these powers because they're very, very good and very, very powerful, but you should really think carefully about how it's going to play with the rest of the rules of the game.
We've seen a lot of examples of people out there who are unhappy with the way the concentration works in Dungeons & Dragons, and they may create a feat or a magic item that allows spellcasters to concentrate on more than one spell at once.
Now, interestingly enough, the rules of D&D 5th edition actually have 2 examples of spells which lose the concentration requirement when they are cast at a higher level. Those are Bestow Curse and Major Image, which if you cast Bestow Curse at 5th level, it no longer requires concentration. And if you cast Major Image at 6th level, it no longer requires concentration. And I find that this is one of the best ways to explore this mechanic by taking a spell and increasing its level by 3 or 4, and that being the requirement to negate its concentration, rather than a blanket requirement or a blanket ability that allows spellcasters to combine spells which might not play nicely with each other.
With all of the things we've looked at in this episode, I think this really highlights the last tip that we have for you, which is to play test it. You have to test your homebrew to make sure it's working properly at the table and doing the things that you wanted it to do without overpowering or underpowering the player characters.
I personally avoid making my campaign the laboratory where I test my new homebrew ideas. Usually with magic items and monsters, it's okay, but with new spells, feats, classes, I always try to test those in a one-shot or share them with other players or other people to get some ideas about if this is really going to work before unleashing it for real in an actual campaign. You can always go back on things. If something isn't working and you've introduced it into your campaign, you should be able to have a frank conversation with the players and dungeon masters and say, hey, this homebrew thing we made, it's way overpowered and we got to fix this now before our whole campaign falls apart. But avoid that by playtesting it in a one-shot.
One-shots are so much fun to play in. They're a great way to meet new people and try out new things. And it's just such a great way to introduce your homebrew and let everybody at the table know, hey, we're going to try something out today that I've created, and then gather feedback from the people at the table to see whether it worked or whether it didn't work. What was great about it? What wasn't great about it? Tweak it a little bit, and then do it in another one shot, maybe with different people, and continue to get feedback and adapt this until you feel you have the perfect homebrewed item to then release to the public or use in your home campaign.
This is one of the things that makes me a little bit skeptical about sharing homebrew for feedback on the internet. Getting anonymous advice from people on Facebook or other social media platforms can be really, really helpful in finding out if you're really off the mark. But if you're really trying to nail your homebrew and maybe put it out into the world as something on the Dungeon Masters Guild or share it with other players, you gotta get good playtesting feedback and advice. And just sharing it out on the internet for anybody to give you armchair advice is not the best way to get that. Find other cool people and ask them, hey, can you try this out in your game? Try it out in your own games, play it with new people. People are always looking for more opportunities to play D&D anyways.
Homebrewing can be very time consuming, but at the end of the day, it can be one of the most rewarding things. Creating your own masterful spell or magic item or class or feat to run at your table that is uniquely yours, and you'll just be proud every time one of the players has a great experience showing off that thing that you created.
And sharing it with the Dungeons & Dragons community is a reward unlike any other. Being able to create something that you've playtested and tried out and that is battle-proven is a really great feather in your cap. And if you are doing a lot of homebrewing, you should really look at things like the Dungeon Masters Guild as platforms to share your amazing work with the community, and as great places for you if you're looking for inspiration and new ideas.
So this has been a look at 5 tips for homebrewing in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Tell us about some of your awesome homebrews in the comments below.
If you're enjoying our show, please consider supporting our work on Patreon. You can find out how by following the links in the description below.
And if you want to see Monty homebrewing everything, check out our live play Dungeons of Drakkenheim, which airs Tuesday nights at 6 p.m. Eastern on Twitch. You can find all the previous episodes right up over here.
And we've got plenty more guides on homebrewing for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time
In the dungeon.